I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed's Sunday feature interview. I'll be back again tomorrow with another weekday episode of Fear and Greed, the normal mix of business news and interviews that sets you up for a successful day. In the meantime, enjoy our Sunday feature interview. At Fear and Greed, we love a good story about Australians having a go. It's at the heart of our founding spirit. We see it in business, even through challenges today, and we love to cover those stories in our podcast. A while ago, I read an article that really sparked my interest. In fact, I was inspired. The story was so well written, and was actually by someone I knew. Garry Linnell is one of Australia's most experienced journalists. He's won several awards for his writing, including a Walkley for Best Feature Writing. He's been Editor-in-Chief of The Bulletin, Editor of the Daily Telegraph, Director of News and Current Affairs for the Nine Network, and Editorial Director of Fairfax. That's where he was my boss. He spent 4 years as co-host of The Breakfast Show on Radio 2UE, and is the author of 5 published books. Amongst all that, he also writes a regular column for the New Daily, and that brings us to this interview. Garry, good morning.
Good morning, Sean. I'm exhausted listening to all of that.
Well, Garry, you've had a very colourful career, there's no doubt about it, and you and I have known each other for quite a while now. But can you tell our listeners how you got to this point, where you started, how you worked your way through the ranks to become literally one of Australia's best writers?
I might give you a long story short, I think, because it feels as though it went on forever. I started off as an 18-year-old cadet with the Age newspaper in Melbourne, but I'd really been writing, I think, ever since I was 5 or 6 years old, always cramming little short stories and science fiction stories in exercise books. And I began filing football match reports for a local suburban paper when I was about 15 or 16 years old. And I guess I always wanted to find a career in writing. My first choice was becoming an astronaut, but I discovered that you require mathematical skills apparently, and of which I had none. And besides, there are a few other jobs like journalism where you get the best seats at some of the biggest events in the world, or you get to stick your nose into other people's business and get paid for it. So I sort of went after that, and I was very, very lucky to get a cadetship, and it sort of all started from there.
And so you worked your way through the Age, and you've worked across those magazines, newspapers, radio. You seem to have done the whole lot.
Basically, I started off as an old-fashioned newspaper reporter, I guess, and then I always wanted to edit. And Kerry Packer gave me the opportunity to become editor-in-chief of the Bulletin just after about the year 2002. And I really loved that. And I spent 4 years there. It was a weekly magazine with a really illustrious and controversial history, really, going back to the 1880s. But it was really the voice of Australia for a time, and it was seeped in history. And it was just one of the great magazines. And sort of I was lucky enough to do that, editing the Daily Telegraph, which was a great adventure as well, and then ending up at Fairfax and then doing radio. So there's been a bit of everything. I've always sort of moved on after 3 or 4 years. Not because I was bored, but probably because someone else moved me on. But I always loved working alongside other journalists, working in newsrooms. And even though the business has changed a hell of a lot in recent years, it's still where all my passions really are.
And what do you love about writing then? Because you've returned to writing books at the moment. What is it about writing that really grabs you?
I think it's a little bit like the way people enjoy painting or writing songs. I just like telling stories, and on those very rare moments when you can get it really right and really capture a moment or a scene, well, you're giving people information, but when you get it right, a good story should always make the reader feel something as well. And it should be like a song that triggers emotions and memories, whether it was that first kiss or the worst breakup of your life. And I always said to reporters who are working with me on papers and magazines, make them feel something. Hit them in the gut as well as in the head. And it's a pretty powerful thing to be able to do. And it doesn't always come together that often. So, it's one of those endless frustrations, I guess, about writing. But when it does happen and those words just fall into place, there's really nothing else like it.
Which brings us to the article you wrote in the New Daily recently. The headline was the greatest story you've probably never heard. And it's really 2 stories, one about India, or a contemporary one from India, and another about Australia's Great Depression. So take us through that. Firstly, the story from India.
Yeah, it was a fascinating story. It happened very early on when the coronavirus pandemic was sweeping around the world. And look, I don't know if you've been to India yourself, but I spent about 5 or 6 weeks there 25 years ago. It is an extraordinary place.
Yeah.
And this story began playing out not just on the crowded and dusty roads of India, which is where it ended up, but it began in New Delhi. There was a young girl who's only 15. Her name is Jyoti Kumari. And her father was one of those migrant workers from a very small village who'd made his way to the big city. He was driving a rickshaw around New Delhi when he was badly injured in an accident, and he hurt his back and legs. He basically couldn't walk. So he was lying on this makeshift bed in a very small room where they were renting, and they were facing eviction because he couldn't pay the rent anymore. So Jyoti used the last of their money to purchase a very old red bike. She propped up her disabled father on the back of the bicycle and began pedalling. And her aim was to get them home to this very small village in the state of Bihar, which was a ride of about 1,200 kilometres. They had no other way of getting back there. And so for days and weeks, they pedalled along those choked roads, which were full of thousands of migrant workers trying to return home because they'd been left jobless by the pandemic. And basically, at this time, all this kindness began to flourish. There were strangers who were going up to them, providing them with food and shelter, inviting them into their homes. And it took about 2 weeks for her, pedalling furiously along these chaotic roads and along these dusty back roads of India. And she finally got them back to their little village in Darbhanga. And there they were acclaimed. And slowly the story began sort of emerging of this incredible story of this young girl riding this old red bike, taking her injured father back home to their village. And it was a story that ended up captivating, I think, millions of people around the world. And then just sort of vanished and disappeared. And the world's attention span pretty much moved on pretty quickly after that.
Yeah, those stories do vanish. Another one, though, that you did write about in the same article was back in 1932, I think, well, the early 30s anyway, a boy named Lenny and his pony, Ginger Mick.
Oh, this is probably one of the greatest stories I'd never really heard about until recently, where I was talking to Dr. Kira Lindsay. She's a tremendous historian, and she likes to look at historical events and look at the big events, but look at them through the eyes of the supporting cast and people you may not have heard of before. And she told me about this little kid called Lenny Gwyther, who was 9 years old. And I was absolutely flabbergasted. I said, well, why haven't I ever heard about him before? This 9-year-old kid who became a really heroic figure back in 1932 when Australia was in the deepest grip of the Great Depression. There were shanty towns springing up on the outskirts of the cities. Unemployment had hit, I think, 30% or more. And there were broken men, often with their families, trudging from town to town looking for food and a rare chance of work. Now, Lenny's father was a World War I hero. He actually won the Military Cross for bravery. Wow. And after the war, he returned home to their small farm, which is just outside the Victorian Gippsland town of Leongatha. And in late 1931, Lenny's father broke his leg and he was laid up in hospital for weeks. And there was real concern over whether or not the farm would actually get through the summer. So 9-year-old Lenny went and got his Ginger Mick, his little pony, saddled him up and ended up ploughing all of the 24 paddocks and effectively saved the family farm from ruin. So to thank him, they asked him what he would like to do. And he said, I've been reading about this incredible structure being built in Sydney called the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And they're opening it in April in 1932. I want to go there and be there at the opening. And there was, his parents were obviously a little bit concerned about letting him go.
How old was he again?
He's 9 years old.
Wow. Yep.
This is not a time with mobile phones, Google Maps, 7-Elevens on the side of the road, nothing. So in the end, they agree. They sketch out a rough map for him and they send him off on his boyhood pony, Ginger Mick. And the two of them undertake this incredible 600-mile journey. There are bushfires, hailstorms. They're attacked by vagrants and hobos. There's long, cold nights in the rain. Basically your normal Australian summer holiday, really. But when word starts to spread, and when they get to Canberra, there's no internet, very little radio, but when they get to Canberra, he's already become famous. Prime Minister Joseph Lyons, who's trying to stitch together an economic plan to resuscitate Australia, invites him into Parliament House for tea. People begin opening up their homes, and letting him stay the night, feeding him. By the time he gets to Sydney, there are tens of thousands of people who line the streets cheering him on as he and sort of Ginger Mick canter down George Street. Don Bradman hears about him, requests a meeting with him, and then gives him a signed bat. Now, Bradman was, the god of Australia at the time. And when it was all over, he attended the official opening. He was given a bit of a role where he and Ginger Mick rode across the bridge. He then hopped on his horse, waved to the crowd, and many of them were crying. And he shouted "Toodle-doo," and began the long journey home.
As you do.
And like there were stories about him for months. And then when you go through them, one of the great resources we have in this country is a thing called Trove, which was set up by the National Library of Australia. Anyone can go on it, and it's free. And it's basically almost every newspaper, tens of thousands of them have been fully digitised.
Wow.
And you can do a search. It's a search function. And you can go back and look at all of the stories that were written about Lenny back in 1932. And it's
Incredible.
quite remarkable. And to me, these two stories just sort of came together, I think, at the right time, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was beginning to emerge right around the world.
So why do we need to know about Jody and Lenny in today, in 2020, in the midst of a pandemic?
I'd like people to go, wow, I thought I had it bad because the damn courier still hasn't delivered all those gadgets and hair products I ordered on the internet yesterday.
You don't order hair products, Garry.
I don't have to, but my wife does, let me tell you.
Right,
and the courier arrives and knocks on the door every day. What these two kids achieved is pretty inspiring, I think.
Yeah.
And it also begs the question, particularly with, say, Lenny Guifer, why haven't we heard more about him?
Yeah.
I reckon his face should be on our currency. There's a small statue in Leongatha commemorating his journey, but that's about it. And, I scratch my head often and go, well, why aren't we learning more about these great stories from our history in our history classes? I'm probably like you, Sean. I sat at the back of the history class and was incredibly bored hearing all of these, tales of Captain Cook arriving and the same old.
Yeah.
And, if only we could inject some of these sort of stories into the curriculum these days, I think you'd have a lot more kids becoming interested in Australian history.
You're doing your part because you've recently written a book about a guy called William Buckley. Tell us about him.
Yeah, well, I think everyone's probably heard the phrase Buckley's chance, or you've got Buckley's. It actually comes from an English convict who was sent out to Australia in 1803, who'd been convicted for stealing 2 small pieces of Irish cloth. He'd actually been a soldier in the 4th Regiment for England and had fought Napoleon's army in the Netherlands. And after he was found guilty, he was originally sentenced to hang, commuted the sentence, put him on a ship and sent him out to Port Phillip. Now, the British were getting very concerned about a lot of French ships in the Pacific, so they wanted to set up a colony in the south, which would later become, obviously, Victoria. Buckley hated it. They'd only been there for about 4 weeks in this very small camp. He escaped one night, was given up for dead, disappeared into the Australian bush. He was adopted by the Wadawurrung Aboriginal people of Port Phillip, all around that sort of Geelong, Cryo Bay area. They embraced him and he became one of them. And he lived with them for 32 years. And in 1835, when John Batman's crew were on the side of Port Phillip, thinking that they just bought 600,000 acres and they were about to set up a village that would eventually become Melbourne, Buckley walked out of the bush wearing possum skins, carrying a spear, and sat down at their campfire, and they began talking to him, but he couldn't have a conversation with them because he'd forgotten the English language.
Wow.
And it took weeks and months for him to get it back. He was eventually employed by Batman as an interpreter to what they called the natives. He found himself eventually trapped between these 2 warring societies and effectively the genocide that took place of the indigenous people of Victoria, and ended up leaving 2 years later and went down to Tasmania, where he married a diminutive, very small Irish widow. Now, William Buckley, one of the striking things about him, he was about 6'6", enormous for his time, a giant man of his time. And he ended up marrying this very tiny woman, and they couldn't walk hand in hand because he was so tall, so they looped a handkerchief around their wrists, and that's how they sort of stayed together when they were walking the streets of Hobart.
Fantastic. What's the book called?
It's called Buckley's Chance. There's a movie being planned right now, actually, and I've knocked back the main starring role, but hopefully someone like Chris Hemsworth can step up to the plate over the coming 12 months. Yeah.
Well, look, if they can't get you, they might go for one of those Hemsworth boys. Before you go, there's another one coming out, Tragic Love Story of Captain Moonlight, the bloody end of the Bushrangers.
This is coming out in late September. It's a ripper of a story. It's set in the 1870s, the dying days of the bushranger era. And you've got the Kelly gang who are still at large. But in 1879, the biggest story in Australia was an Irish preacher who had turned into a bushranger called Andrew George Scott, who called himself Captain Moonlight. He'd already served 7 years in Pentridge, robbed a bank of £1,000. But in 1879, he and a gang of 5 young men went to the Wantabadgery station near Gundagai. They lay siege to it, took 40 hostages. He was eventually captured and hanged, and he was hanged by the executioner of New South Wales, the legendary Nosy Bob, Robert Rice Howard, who didn't have a nose. I just love that
Right.
great Aussie tradition of giving someone a nickname. His nose had been kicked off by a horse years earlier. But what is really interesting about this story and why I love it so much, Moonlight was actually in love with a young and impressionable man in his gang called James Nesbitt, who was shot and killed during that siege. And we know all about this because Moonlight wrote dozens of letters from his death cell on the eve of his hanging in 1880.
Which you got access to.
Yeah, I mean, they're in the archives, and he talks about this incredible passionate love he had for this man and his desire to be reunited with him in death. Incredibly moving. And this was not a time in history when men who loved one another so openly were admired or respected a lot. So the book talks about that struggle and also the last days of Captain Moonlight and Ned Kelly and all of those bushrangers.
I look forward to it. You're pretty busy, Gary. You're living there on the central coast of New South Wales. Keep writing books for the next couple of years, or?
Yeah, I'm just starting work on another one, which is about one of the suspects in the Jack the Ripper killings who moved to Australia in the early 1890s and couldn't really help himself, but he ended up murdering his latest wife and buried her underneath the fireplace of a small house in Melbourne. And it turned out that his previous wife, he'd murdered her and their 4 kids 6 months earlier. He had a long history of being a forger, swindler, bigamist, all-round evil villain, I guess. He was captured and hanged in Melbourne, but the story was a global sensation. There were 12,000 people outside the Melbourne jail on the morning that he was hanged. His name was Frederick Deeming. He was defended at his trial by a guy called Alfred Deakin, who went on to become the second Prime Minister of Australia. And I mean, it's just a marvellous story. I'm really enjoying researching it at the moment.
How do you find these stories?
You stumble over them. You sort of, when you start going through things like Trove, which I was telling you about, and going through the old files, one thing tends to lead to another. And so you just jot down interesting things that you come across. And I mean, the 19th century here in Australia was an incredible time. You had a nation that was just beginning to emerge and get over its convict origins. And it had a real chip on its shoulder about its past. And this story that I'm working on at the moment, it's also in the midst of the spiritualism craze. So everyone, you didn't sit down and watch Netflix at night or listen to podcasts like Fear and Greed. You actually sat down and had a seance. And everyone was doing it. Alfred Deakin he believed in ghosts and spirits. And the spirits would come and tap their tables and communicate with them from purgatory. It's an amazing era in our history, and I'm just not too sure how I'm going to squeeze all of that into one book. I'll see how I go.
Good luck with it, Gary. Garry Linnell, thanks very much for joining us on Fear and Greed this morning.
Thank you, Sean.
That was author and journalist Garry Linnell.